My grandmother survived the Holocaust by Dopabeane. My grandmother told me the story. Her name was 𝐘𝐸. She was born in Poland and came of age as Hitler's Reich swept across Europe with all the inexorability of the tide. Her father, Kem, was a cobbler of extraordinary talent. He could create a good, strong shoe from garbage. This was an unusual gift, and even though they lived in a more enlightened age, many of his neighbors believed it was at least partially magic. At some point, the neighbors collectively decided that Kem couldn't chant shoes, so they came to him, asking for luck, wisdom, and, as that terrible death tide ebbed ever closer, safety. Kem was such a successful cobbler that he and his wife, Zofia, began to hope that they might one day be wealthy. They dreamed of a large shoe shop for Kem, of purebred dogs for 𝐘𝐸, expansive gardens for Zofia, and a large, airy house for all of them. It seemed not only possible, but certain, that the sheer force of Kem's devotion and talent would effortlessly create a happy ending. But as they would soon learn, there are things even a father's love cannot prevent or overcome. Now, 𝐘𝐸 had many friends, so she naturally heard rumors of her father's benevolent sorcery. These stories both frightened and excited her. One night, she went to Kem and asked, "Papa, is it true you could make magic shoes?" He pulled her onto his lap, laughing. "Maybe I could." "But do you?" He ruffled her hair. "I think I did, once, and I suppose I could again, but only for those that I love." 𝐘𝐸 found this answer deeply unsatisfying. "What does that mean?" "It means that love is the only real magic, my darling." He then ushered her off to help Zofia. 𝐘𝐸 did as he bade, even though she felt annoyed and dissatisfied. Her father always spoke in riddles and nonsense poetry, but that, she supposed, was the price she paid for a kind and gentle father. And it was quite a low price when all was said and done. Because her father was so talented, her childhood passed unblighted by his heritage. Not until her 11th birthday did the neighbors begin a campaign of harassment. It built so slowly that they hardly noticed it, until finally, one terrible, hot day, the butcher refused to sell meat to Kem. "All out," he said gruffly. "Come back again another time." Kem thought nothing of it, and moved on to the next shop, where he received the same dismissal. He tried other stores, other shops, and each one turned him away. At first, Kem refused to believe that something was wrong. You see, Kem was a terribly sweet and loving man, hard-working, honest to the point of naivety. All he wanted was a good life for his family. Each day, year in and year out, his only goals were to keep their hearts happy, their bellies full, and their bodies warm and safe. 𝐘𝐸 told me, always, that Kem was the perfect father. But even perfect fathers cannot turn bad neighbors into good, brave men, and the shunning of 𝐘𝐸's family continued. At first, they assumed it was because Kem's family was Romani, outsiders, undesirables, rat people, gypsies, so low that they were even beneath the Jews, who Hitler called the race tuberculosis of the world. As food became scarcer and people became more afraid, they turned on each other, casting even their kindest neighbors out of the fold. And maybe Kem's Roma blood was the problem at first, and it would have been bad enough. But then a neighbor, some cruel, petty, panicked neighbor, reported that 𝐘𝐸's mother, Zofia, was a Jew. The Nazis came soon after, violently tearing 𝐶𝐸 family and dozens of others away from the city and forcing them into a cold, filthy ghetto far from home. Zofia and 𝐶𝐸 wept every day, and so did 𝐘𝐻 for a little while. But a good father's love and duty knows no bounds. So he pulled himself together and piled his trade within the confines of the ghetto. He had no materials with which to make new shoes, but with a few scraps and pieces of rubbish, he could make any shoe as good as new. Now, because of Zofia, the family had gone to a Jewish ghetto. Most of the people there refused to associate with 𝐘𝐻 since he was a gypsy. A few didn't mind his gypsiness, however, and they'd bought their shoes to 𝐘𝐻 regularly. They asked him for blessings, for magic, and because it couldn't hurt, because it created hope, and hope is a beautiful thing. Sometimes the only beautiful thing we have. 𝐘𝐻 happily blessed each pair brought to him. Whispers persisted of gypsy magic and dirty fraud, of course, but customers still came, intent of buying one last piece of hope. Prayer wasn't working, you see, and gypsy magic had become their last defense against the hideous rumors coming out of the East. 𝐶𝐸 didn't know how long she lived in the ghetto, only that it probably was not as long as it seemed. Toward the end, 𝐘𝐻 became more obsessed than ever with shoes, specifically new shoes for 𝐶𝐸 and Zofia. Back in the city, it wouldn't have been a problem. Here in the ghetto, though, there was almost nothing to work with, so he improvised. 𝐶𝐸 didn't have the stomach to confirm it, but she suspected a few rats and cats sacrificed their skins for these shoes. 𝐘𝐻 worked for weeks on the shoes, frantic and feverish. "You need them," he told 𝐶𝐸. "You've outgrown your old shoes. Winter is almost here, and I'll be damned if I don't fulfill my duty to you." He said this often, at least once a week, and wept every time. Finally, on her 13th birthday, just as the season's first bitter snowfall drifted down from a cold iron sky, the train came for her family. The Nazis stuffed them into crowded, icy cars with hundreds of other people. There were no blankets in the train cars, no straw, not even solid walls. Holes bored through the cheap wood, and the planks fit together badly, leaving large cracks around which ice blossomed. By this time, all three of them were terribly ill. Zofia had it worst. A deep, wet sickness had settled in her chest, squeezing her lungs and stealing her air each time she drew a ragged breath. That illness claimed Zofia on the second night. She died with her frail body curled around 𝐘𝐻's. 𝐶𝐸 desperately held her mother's hand and breathed on them, praying that the warmth might revive her. But it didn't, and Zofia died as the moon rose over the hills, spilling heartless cold light through the cracks and holes in the side. 𝐶𝐸 wept helplessly as 𝐘𝐻, in his own way equally helpless, began to work. 𝐶𝐸 cried herself to sleep, and 𝐘𝐻 labored into the night, working his stiff, withered hands to the bone. Sometime mid-morning, 𝐶𝐸 awoke, wrapped in her mother's stiff arms. She disentangled herself and noticed that 𝐘𝐻 had removed Zofia's shoes. 𝐶𝐸 screamed and used all her strength to try and pry her mother's shoes from her father's hands. But 𝐘𝐻 was far too strong for her, far too determined, and no matter what she did, he continued to work, impervious to her rage. So profound was 𝐶𝐸's pain that she didn't even know what 𝐘𝐻 was doing, nor did she care. On the fourth day at sunrise, the train stopped. Around her, surviving passengers wept and screamed and clutched the dead bodies of their lost loved ones. Despite her anger and deep sense of betrayal, Tirani crawled to her father as the doors shuddered open, blinding them with clear morning light. Kem held her, whispering nonsensical assurances as the guards boarded the car and threw everyone off. They'd been deposited at a rail junction. Their train, newly empty, chugged off the way it had came. Two other trains waited, engines sending stinking clouds of exhaust into the otherwise pristine air. Tirani noticed none of this. She was only painfully, deliciously aware of the frosted grass under her feet, of clear yellow sun and the dramatic interplay of light and blue shadow on the mountains around them. A stream burbled nearby. She ran to it, heart aching. Tirani hadn't seen running water in what felt like 100 years. She collapsed by the stream. Grass and soft earth cushioned her fall. In spite of her sickness, she dipped both hands into the stream and splashed her face. It was terribly cold, so cold it hurt her skin and stung her eyes and sent sharp pains rocketing through her skull. But it was beautiful. It was clean. Kem came up beside her and swept her hair back from her face. Tirani, Tirani, my darling. They're going to separate us. Horror and desperate sorrow seized Tirani. I heard them, he continued. Tears shimmered in his eyes. Tirani began to cry. They're separating the men from the women. Take these. He presented the shoes, her mother's shoes. Only they were not her mother's shoes, at least not entirely. New leather and sturdy soles gleamed in the morning light. As she wept, Kem slipped her old shoes off and laced the new shoes on. Don't take them off. Not for anything or anyone. Not until you are safe. He tied each shoe, then grabbed Tirani's hands. I love you, Tirani. More than anything. More than my life. More than God. Before Tirani could answer, the guards came and pulled them apart. Because there are things even a father's love cannot stop. She screamed and kicked as they dragged her away. Her father stood by the stream, watching her with haunted eyes. Only then did she see that her father, her poor, helpless father, was barefoot. She struggled, shrieking at the top of her lungs until a guard hit her in the head with the butt of his rifle. Stars rocketed across her vision, and darkness took over. Tirani never saw Kem again. She woke aboard the new train, only 15 minutes from the camp. As the prisoners exited the train, guards sorted them into groups. The vast majority of the women and children were shunted toward low, gray buildings, belching smoke into the sky. Tirani expected to go with them, but one of the guards, narrow-faced with luxurious black hair, pulled her aside with an appraising look. Then, even though she was frail and white-faced, half-starved and clearly ill, he shoved her toward the other line, toward the strong-bodied workers. Guards took rings and paper and trinkets and all of the remaining belongings from other prisoners. Tirani expected they would take her shoes, but they merely shoved her through without a second look. Life at the camp was a frozen, lonely hell, although it quickly became apparent that Tirani was decidedly less frozen than her companions. Though the cold, deadly winter subsumed the camp, the Nazis gave no quarter. Every inmate, no matter how ill, hungry, or frail, was forced to work. Even as shoes wore down to nothing and clothing drifted away thread by thread, the Nazis made the prisoners perform pointless and pointlessly cruel labor for hours each day. Infection and frostbite ran rampant. On the worst days, 𝐬𝐿 watched in horror as men and women, delirious with fever, snapped their frozen toes off one by one. 𝐬𝐿's toes never froze. Her father's shoes made sure of that. In fact, no part of her ever froze. She was not comfortable by any means, but she was alright. Even on the worst days, the coldest days, the days she woke up to the frozen corpses of her fellow inmates, she barely even shivered. Most amazing of all, the nights were tolerable. 𝐬𝐿 rather believed this was the hallucination of a deluded mind, however, because on the nights when she was most comfortable, she would feel something warm and liquid creep up from her feet and spread up over her head. As winter raged on, visions began to accompany this creeping warmth. Translucent fur, smooth and short, like the house cat she'd fed in the ghetto. Even more strangely, dim stars shone within the fur. Tiny yellow pinpricks, twinkling in the soft, warm darkness. She could still see the barracks through this queer, invisible skin, still hear the cries and screams of the women around her, even the wails from the men's barracks, but she felt insulated from all of it, separated, protected. Delusion or not, this warmth allowed her to rest when no one else could, and kept her reasonably healthy, even as people withered to frozen revenants around her. It made 𝐬𝐿 sad, but distantly so. She had no friends in the barracks. She'd seen the way they snuck and stole from each other, the way they raided the fresh corpses every morning. She'd seen the other inmates eyeing her shoes, seen the covetousness in their eyes, and was deeply afraid that she would be killed for them. One brutal morning, during a pointless mission dragging logs all the way across the camp, she heard something so beautiful she thought it was a hallucination. A soft, sweet voice drifting up and down in a beautiful, wordless song. 𝐬𝐿 glanced around her. The guards paid her no attention. They were miserably cold and deeply disgruntled, stamping their feet and conversing amongst themselves as the inmates toiled. The black-haired guard was still there. He glanced at her once, then returned his attention to his companion. 𝐬𝐿 saw her chance and ducked away. She found the singer pressed against the fence of the farthest barracks. He was small and frail, barely taller than 𝐬𝐿. His face was terribly pale and monstrously thin. But his eyes were beautiful and kind. Like her, he wore a threadbare uniform. Unlike hers, it was emblazoned with a faded pink triangle. 𝐬𝐿 thought it was rather pretty and told him so. He shook his head blearily, then smiled. 𝐬𝐿 scanned the area. The guards were still occupied, so she leaned in, curling her fingers around the frozen wire of the fence, and said, "You have a beautiful voice. What is your name?" The man shook his head and made nonsense sounds. When she still didn't understand, he sang a swift, liquid scale, holding his mouth open. That's when she saw he had no tongue. Deep sorrow crushed her, the worst she'd felt since they took her away from her father. She thrust her bony wrists through the fence and impulsively grabbed the mute man's hand. He grasped it with both of his and squeezed. Tears spilled down his face, and he smiled again. He held up a hand, ensuring he had her attention, then reached down and raked a fingertip through the dirt, spelling out his name. Lucas. Then a guard finally noticed them. Flat gray sky glimmered off familiar black hair as he surged forward, breaking them apart and dragging 𝐬𝐿 away. By this time, 𝐬𝐿 knew better than to fight. She couldn't help but look back over her shoulder. Lucas, of the pink triangle, rose clumsily to his feet, looking stricken and angry. That was how 𝐬𝐿 met her only friend in the entire camp. Every day, she went back to see him, bringing scraps of food. At first, pieces from her own bowl, and later, gifts from the black-haired guard. 𝐂𝐫𝐲 couldn't speak, but he wrote well and quickly. He was a singer from Berlin, only 19 years old. He'd been incarcerated for homosexual behavior. When he closed this to her, he glanced up at her anxiously, awaiting judgment that never came. Chirani did not care. Love was the only real magic in the world, and it didn't matter to her who shared love with whom. The men with the pink triangles were tortured and subjected to hideous experiments, more so even than the other prisoners. 𝐂𝐫𝐲 had been injected with all manner of chemicals and poisons. When that failed, the Nazis had boiled his manhood away so that he could never practice his perversion ever again. Others had been used as targets for trainee SS officers. 𝐂𝐫𝐲 himself was not sure why or how he was alive. He was so thin, sickly, and crippled now. He proved this by pulling off his thin slippers, revealing several missing toes. Every day, Chirani held Lucas's hand. Every day, Chirani held 𝐂𝐫𝐲's hands and wished, from the bottom of her heart, for a second pair of magic shoes. Their friendship was quickly noticed. The black-haired guard didn't like their bond, and soon enough stopped sending her to 𝐂𝐫𝐲's side of the camp. The guards found other women, sicker women, to perform their pointless chores, and confined Chirani to the barracks. It angered her, but it was also a relief. She was able to sleep more, able to lose herself in the soft, sleek fur and warm stars of her invisible shoe cocoon. The more time she spent inside of it, the warmer it seemed. One night, on impulse, she extended her fingertips and nervously began to stroke the air around her. The fingers touched nothing, but noticeable warmth grew around her. After a while, a low, comforting hum reverberated through her bones, a physical lullaby, and lulled her to sleep. Still, Chirani found little joy in her plight. She was forced to lounge about, wallowing in relative comfort she couldn't share, as sicker women suffered and died. And it got worse. Food became sparser, yet the black-haired guard insisted on slipping her scraps of food from his table. She hated him for it, and every day resolved to toss the food on the ground and grind it into the dirt. But every day she was too hungry, and every day she accepted his little favors, even as the other inmates starved. It was worse somehow than anything that she had gone through. Her only comforts were thoughts of her parents, her memories of 𝐂𝐫𝐲, and of course her strange, invisible shoe guardian. She'd taken to stroking it every night, thanking it and Chem for its protection. As winter bled into a crisp, bitter spring, her fellow inmates continued to die. At first, the barracks refilled, but even that trickled to a stop. Whether it was because the Nazis had truly managed to finally kill all the Jews, or because they were diverting new prisoners to other camps, she didn't know. All she knew was one night, her last companion died, leaving her alone in the frosty barracks. As she lay on her thin, cold bed, dreamily stroking her invisible protector, the door clattered open and the black-haired guard entered. Chirani sat up, willing her heart to stop pounding. The familiar warmth evaporated, shrinking down to her shoes and disappearing. Cold broke over her like a dark, cruel tide, and for the first time since entering the camp, Chirani began to shiver. The guard approached, boots snapping against the hard ground. Moonlight reflected off his black hair, turning it to a blued silver. He stopped before her bed. "You bitch," he said softly. Chirani recoiled. His voice was strange, almost dreamy. "You filthy, teasing little whore." Each word produced a heavy cloud that stank of cheap liquor. "You know what I want. Every day I show you. Every day I give you food from my table. I go without so that you can have something." He angrily indicated the empty barracks. "Do you see? You are the only one left. That is because of me. I saved your life. I am still saving your life." He wrapped a hand around her throat, a gesture that was falsely tender and gravely threatening. "You have never thanked me, but you will tonight." The guard pushed her down, and suddenly 𝐘𝐨 was flooded with warmth, blazing, purifying heat. The guard screeched and reared back, falling to the door. He stood, eyes blazing in the clear spring moonlight, and charged. The warmth disappeared from her suddenly. Panic immobilized her. The beautiful warmth had been her guardian's last hand, and it was finally over. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end as the guard screamed in rage. Or was it terror? He screamed again, but fell silent far too quickly, almost as if he'd been cut off. Silence followed. After a long time, 𝐘𝐨 finally opened her eyes. Before her, barely visible in the darkness, was an undulating shape covered in soft, dark fur and glimmering stars. The guard was nowhere to be seen. After a while, the starry fur wrapped itself around her, warmth, beautiful and soothing, and hot as a summer's day, enveloped her, along with profound tiredness. "Thank you," 𝐘𝐨 whispered, and fell asleep. The camp was liberated not long after. 𝐘𝐨 was still the last in her barracks, but far from the last in the camp. She exited the gates, shouldering her way through the chaos, trying to ignore the horror on the faces of the soldiers around her as she scanned the crowd for 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬. Finally, she saw him. Her face broke into a smile, and she ran over, but quickly saw that something was wrong. Her smile turned into a frown when she understood. 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬 was on the wrong side of the fence, still imprisoned. He stared out at her with fear and a serenely profound sadness. Panicked, 𝐘𝐨 ran to one of the soldiers and tugged his sleeve. He reluctantly faced her, unable to hide the revulsion in his eyes. She pointed desperately to 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬 and mimed unlocking a door. The soldier's face hardened. "No, criminals," he said. "Criminals. You understand? They stay here." Then he patted her head awkwardly and walked away. 𝐘𝐨 ran to 100 guards, just as her father had gone to 100 shops an eternity ago. Some laughed. A handful hugged her. Most, however, gruffly repeated the words, "Criminals." Soon, far too soon, it was time to leave. And still, 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬 languished behind the fence. 𝐘𝐨 would escape. She would survive. But 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬, poor, sweet, frail 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬, would continue to suffer. She ran her hands along the fence, scrabbling for a weak spot, a hole, anything she could tear open. But there was nothing. After a while, 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬 gently took her hands and began to sing. 𝐘𝐨 sobbed. Soon, 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬's fine, wordless voice wavered, then broke. And then, he was crying too. Suddenly, 𝐘𝐨 had an idea. A soldier came to her nervously. "Time to go," he said. 𝐘𝐨 sat down and feverishly began to untie her shoes. The soldier watched, nonplussed, as she pulled the shoes off and heaved them over the fence at 𝐂𝐫𝐲𝐬. "Put them on." It was a battle to keep her voice steady, one she almost lost. "Don't take them off. Never take them off. Not until you're safe." 𝐂𝐫𝐲 stared at her, frightened and hurt and terribly confused. "Put them on!" she screamed. This broke his paralysis, and he did as she asked, shucking his worn slippers and lacing the boots over his feet. Even though they were women's shoes, they fit him because his feet were narrow and he had almost no toes. Then the soldier led her away. Unable to help herself, 𝐘𝐨 looked back over her shoulder. 𝐂𝐫𝐲 clung to the fence, watching her go. Maybe it was her imagination, but it didn't seem like he was shivering anymore. A few years later, 𝐘𝐨 married an American soldier and emigrated. I'm happy to say 𝐂𝐫𝐲 survived, and that 𝐘𝐨's husband, my grandfather, helped her bring him to America. 𝐂𝐫𝐲 was still crippled and frail, and though he died long before I was born, he lived with my grandparents the rest of his life. My own father remembers him with utmost affection as Uncle Luke. When they found him, he no longer had the shoes. With great hesitation, he wrote that he had passed the boots along to a friend, one destined to remain imprisoned long after 𝐂𝐫𝐲 himself was released. He was afraid 𝐘𝐨 would hate him for it, but she only smiled, because love is magic, and magic is love. And even though a father's sacrifice cannot always save the world, it can save the lives of his children and their dearest loved ones. And it did. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to click on the video on the screen. Also, if you feel like it, please like this video and subscribe to my channel so I can grow it and continue to provide you with high quality content. If you want to stay updated with my work, check out my socials in the description and feel free to reach out with ideas, suggestions, or just to say hello. I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe, and most importantly, keep traveling down the dark path.